Hey everyone, it's Pho and Jack here, and today we're going to be talking about
All kinds of stuff, actually, because there was a recent debate between Dave Smith and Walter Block on Tom Woods' show. And when we watched it, we were kind of shocked at how both Dave and Walter had some philosophical inconsistencies in some of their positions. And we thought that we really need to bring some light to this because it's not right to have, these two people come together and give these positions in such a way that is going to end up leading to people being confused on libertarian ethics and principles. We want people to really have a consistent framework, and we need to bring some realignment to that discourse so that people are more principled in their thinking and their outcomes for things.
that sounds great. All right, where would you like to start? Should we summarize just first what they were even debating about in the first place and what each of their positions were, when debating with each other?
Yeah, definitely. I think we should, kind of focus in on their topic question because when Tom did the debate, he had it as a prompt. They did a traditional kind of debate thing where it was basically saying, should Israel be supported in its war against Hamas?
Right.
And, even that framing has its own kind of logical problems from the Rothbardian point of view.
Right, because when you say Israel,
Right.
who are you talking about? The state of Israel, which has taxation and conscription? Are you talking about the people of Israel and individuals in Israel who actually had their family taken hostage by Hamas? I think the question from the show seemed to be more about the state of Israel and focused on these entities, Hamas, or the government of Israel as the actual entities in this case, when they're actually more just groups. So is that what you're saying is...
Right. When you're talking about these types of topics, right, if you're coming from a libertarian Rothbardian point of view, you're already trying to work outside of statism. So if you're already engaged in the statist framework and you're working from this kind of anthropomorphized collectivist mentality, Israel is not a living single entity. It's not some individual being that has a consciousness. It's an amorphous group of people in leadership that changes over time. They have interests. They have their own incentives in economics.
Right.
They have their own, differing things that change over time.
It's like saying
it's
the
fluid.
Chinese community.
Right.
Or the immigrants.
Right.
Like every immigrant's the same.
Yeah.
They're all either peaceful or bad. There's no individual variation or specificity.
Right.
So that's more
exactly.
the initial, philosophical thing that we want people to really focus on is when you think about these world events and issues, you have to look at people as individuals, and you need to break things down and learn about what has happened in terms of individual actors and actions.
Exactly. And I think that whenever someone works in the group mindset, then they're imputing different actions and actors over time. They're imputing things that are not static and may not represent all people through all time, including even the leadership and those who call themselves government. So it's a very
they
difficult
act like
analysis
it's just one blob, like one giant hive mind that is Israel. Like every Jew has the Sabbath or something. Like they're just one hive mind.
Right, exactly.
They agree on everything. They have
Right, and that's even just silly when you think about it. Even for us, in the U.S., you have different people who have different values across the spectrum.
So different.
So
I
different.
mean, how many Americans have been here for generations and they're super socialist or communist or Marxist, versus capitalist and individualist. There's huge variation even if you were born here and your family has been in America for generations.
Right. Yeah, and that's just, getting to the root here is that, even in America, you have Biden as president. It doesn't even mean most people even support him or this or that. Just like in Israel, there's different people who do or don't support what the government does. There's different parts of the Israeli government where there's, people taking certain actions or people who are critical, right? There's past presidents like Ehud Barak who's critical of the current administration. So it's not this, one size fits all thing. So, going back to the root where they had this question, this framework, a lot of the times when they were having this discourse, in the beginning, they were engaged in this, best option or comparative philosophy mentality. And again, with philosophy, it is good to make comparisons and to say, okay, which could be worse or which could be better in terms of getting closer to an ethical outcome. But no matter what way you cut it, if you're not educating people on the nature of the state and not being realistic about the outcomes that you're advocating for, you can be advocating for positions that are still violating people's bodily, and
Right.
outer property rights. You could be advocating for things that continue the violence, even though you say, oh, well, I don't want these harms to happen. Well, that's great.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that, oh, no future violence ever again. So we have to break
Are you
these
saying
things
that's
down.
what Dave and Walter advocated for? Is that ultimately their positions, and we should summarize, like, for everyone if you didn't watch it, what was their position on, should you support the state of Israel in their war against Hamas?
Right. So Dave Smith's position is simply that Israel is the full-out aggressor, that they are essentially a colonial, manifestation of Jews coming to the area, forcibly displacing people, committing an act of genocide against people in Gaza, and that anything essentially that happens to the Jews there is just a product of blowback. And chiefly, it is a self-fulfilling cycle. That's
Right.
his position. That there is
Right.
there is effectively no outside threat or independent ideology that, on its own, is a threat to Jews generally or in the area. Historically, that it's just occupation by Israel. Israel is this purely occupied state, which
Right.
again is.
That
If you're
it's
calling
a
yourself
p-
the Rothbardian,
you're saying his
every
position-
state's an occupation. But
Right.
it's
You're
just silly,
saying that his yes, that's true. And
Yeah.
also, but you're saying his position is that Hamas is just a reaction to the state of Israel occupying that area, and that they have no other separate beliefs, irrational beliefs, such as, okay, we want to kill all Jews, and Jews are the root of all evil. Like, he doesn't have that position. He sees them as just purely innocent victims who are just reacting, and Hamas is just doing, they're just acting in self-defense. That's his position.
Right. Fundamentally, because of how he frames it,
Mm-hmm.
he is framing it that even if he calls them like the biggest gang in an open-air prison,
Right.
that language imputes that they are in a reactive situation, that they're
Right.
imprisoned, and they
Right.
are a product of that. They don't have this type of moral independent agency, essentially, that they just can't help themselves but fight back and do whatever it takes to fight back. That is what's called the unstated assumption in logic. When you make a claim, and in order for that claim to be true, or how you characterize it with language, there are things that you may not say, but it has to be true in order for that to be true. And that's the unstated assumption, is that, well, okay, if you're calling it this, in this terms, well, then you're saying they're just reacting. It's purely, oh, I'm reacting to being oppressed. I'm reacting to being occupied, and I don't have, agency over that.
Right. So therefore, his answer to, Tom's question for that debate would be, no, you shouldn't support the state of Israel in their war against Hamas.
Right. He
His
would
answer is
say that
no,
what they're doing is
and-
escalation.
Right. And on top of his answer being no, he has his own oughts of what he thinks should happen. Could you summarize that for people? Like, he has specific views on what he wants to happen with Palestine and Hamas, like such as having them, quote, repatriated, which just means giving them the ability to vote in Israeli elections, right? And so he has
Essentially-
specific status solutions. As
Right, and that's what's kind of wild, is that, they're saying they're coming at this from a Rothbardian position, but yet he's here advocating for, and this is,
for more collective.
right, he's saying either
property
they should
rights,
have
yeah.
another state, which again would not be moving away from statism, that'd be adding another incentive system
Right.
of people, engaged in democracy and the incentives there. Or a repatriation program, because, and again, this is by unstated assumption based on what you're saying. If you say you have a right to move back, you have
Right.
a right to be reintegrated, you're saying you have a right to then be living where you may have formerly, your ancestors formerly were, and to have participatory protections under citizenship. Because you can't complain and say, well, they don't have these citizenship rights, right? You can't make that complaint without then that unstated assumption being, well, then they need to have this to have true justice.
Right.
So either way, it's, you can say that either of these avenues have been implicated by Dave, that either a two-state solution or some type of repatriation with full citizenship. Either way, it's an integration into governance and more state control. Either way.
Right. And dictating what this monopoly on violence's rules should be, and basically, playing policy, which is an interesting position to me, just on the side note, because I've also seen Dave, advocate and say that we need to have strong immigration control in the United States, and let's put all the military at the border, he's all about having this collective thoughts against immigrants, this collective stereotype, and say, okay, well, we got to vet everyone coming in, because, if you just allow everyone to come in and vote, they're going to be voting for communism and socialism. And so we got to vet everybody, or they might be violent. So we got to do that. So it just kind of seems totally contradictory to his advocation for Hamas to be forcibly, immigrated into the state of Israel. I don't know. I just think that's interesting.
No, I mean, what you're saying is a perfect encapsulation of the hypocrisy. Is that on one hand,
that's what happens when you're collectivist.
That is what happens
and don't have a strict adherence to the principles of individual liberty and rights. Well, because then you can just come up with any word salad based in collectivism and advocate for whatever policy you want that justifies what you want to see, but isn't actually grounded in considering individuals and their bodies and their existing property.
Well, and especially important to note here, because, again, we have to be very specific. Mm-hmm. The idea of having that border, if you want to talk about the southern border, because I guess they're not too worried about Canadians coming over at this point.
Yeah, no one talks about Canadians.
The snow Mexicans are not really a concern.
Canadians.
For whatever reason. But the southern border is really what they're talking about.
They got speech control.
Right. In that context, right, there's no consideration for past conquest there, right? Because when we're going to compare apples to apples, the question is, okay, Israel, the government, and eventually the Irgun and whoever became the IDF, they conquered the region, right? And I'm not saying this as a pro-con. I'm just saying this is just history. This is what happened. It's not a good thing. It's just this is what happened. So conquest, right, is what happens before you have a state and a takeover. The United States federal government had conquest as against the Mexican government. They beat them out in the Mexican-American War in the mid-1800s, and Mexico lost 55% of the territory, it claimed for that government.
That's
right?
Huge. That's like the majority.
Right. It's like if you cut the United States in half, and half of it went to China or Russia.
Or
so
Britain. Oh, God.
So that is a conquest. And then after that, what happened is the people who were still here, Mexicans living here, were naturalized, and their children were, and so forth. But the U.S. government reneged on its promises to keep those people there, and the U.S. government forcibly removed people under repatriation programs, even leading to, I think it was 1954, which is after Israel was created, removing 1.3 million Mexicans, some who were just workers, some who were actual citizens, many of whom were children. So we're talking about nearly 2 million Mexicans removed over time out of the United States by force. And you don't hear Dave saying, oh, well, those people need to be given repatriation because they were kicked out of their homes and they were even citizens naturalized. Therefore, we need to give Mexico back their territory.
They need to go through the LGBTQ plus trans military we now have. And they need to be vetted by them and vaxxed and controlled by the pharmaceutical and military industrial complexes. That's what they need.
Right.
But see, they're not Palestinians.
Right.
And our government is not Jewish. So.
Well, I mean, and
therefore,
not just
different.
We also have the different Native American tribes.
Right.
And some will try to say, and I think they may have brought this up, like, oh, some of the Native tribes had collective ownership. But then again, I'm going to always compare across the board. Those who were in the region, who today self-identify as Palestinians, they wouldn't have, going back, this early time, the 1800s. The Ottoman land code that was developed under the Ottoman Empire had shared ownership too for them because they had this thing called the Musha system. And so they would have agricultural rotation based on a lottery. No one truly owned the land. A lot of people actually were absentee landlords, and they had crony deeds with the government because they would be the rich people doing the deals, buying people off. And the fellahin, those were the people who were the laborers who were poor. They swapped off the lands. They never actually owned it because they kept having to trade off with the lottery system. And a lot of times they stayed underneath these leases because they wanted to avoid taxes and conscription, which, good for them. But these same arguments apply. Oh, Native Americans had collective ownership. Yeah, that also applies then to the Palestinians by the same token. So there's no consistency whatsoever to these frameworks.
Right.
There is absolutely no and it makes sense when you think about it because it's an ends justifies the means argument. It's just, well, you're just too old and you lost your land at this time, even though the Mexicans were being removed in the mid-1900s, later than Israel. They don't care. They're just like, well, too bad, so sad. Oh, well, you're conquered. But conquest doesn't count anymore. And again, this wasn't even something that was unusual for the time in terms of people being displaced. I mean, after World War II, there was 1 million Germans kicked out of European countries because they were mad at what H-Man did. There were literally 14 million people displaced when Pakistan was created under the partition plan with the British mandate. And there was 1 million people killed in the Islamic Hindu conflict. But nobody cares about those people.
You could also talk about the Chinese, the Vietnamese,
right.
The Cambodians. Oh, and what else? Oh, the Jews. Maybe the Jews literally, like, not the Jews like all, but like throughout history being pushed out of different countries that they go into.
Well, and they
except for New York
nearly 1 million of them were also forcibly displaced from
Yeah.
various Islamic majority countries in the wake of Israel's creation because they said, oh, we don't want anyone who could possibly support this Zionist creation. So
Right.
they started persecuting Jews even heavier, which there already was persecution in terms of different tax structures and stuff like that and
Right.
banning on professions. But they made it worse, and then the Israeli government took in those refugees. So you have this situation where this particular government structure takes the refugees. The surrounding ones, by and large, were refusing the people who fled out of Israel. And they continued to be used as political tools to say, oh, see, this is why you're so bad. See how these people suffer. Whereas in any other situation, it was just, okay, cool, get resettled, and then that's it. It's over and done. And that's for millions upon millions of people. Cyprus, you can name it. There's so many different countries that in all the boundary redrawings after World War II, there was people who were displaced and kicked out and had to move around the world. And it's not that it's a good thing. It's sad, but it has to be recognized for what it is that this is not a consistent philosophy.
Yeah, there are double standards.
Right,
for
it's
sure.
double standards
some
across
is
the board.
like, okay, like if you see Cubans fleeing or Venezuelans fleeing, you don't blame them for fleeing. You blame the violence that was initiated on them. And same thing with the Jews. You don't blame the individual Jews who are seriously just seeking refuge for freedom, like away from Germany, away from Hitler. You can cut that. But, like now they're settled here in the state of Israel, New York City, Boca Raton, like in the biggest pockets. But you wouldn't blame those individuals when they weren't the ones who initiated violence. If they went ahead and settled in because they were invited in, and they paid for that land anyway, then there you go.
Well, I mean, the question of refugee and colonizing and stuff like that just depends on, one's perspective of what someone's doing afterward, whether they're trying to create their own government and culture, imposition. That's often what people think about, I think, with refugees. Like, you need to assimilate, if you're going to come over, that kind of thing. But I think that still just misses the point that fundamentally, when it comes to this philosophical contention, there's no consistency in this metric. If you're going to make an assertion that, repatriation is a right after conquest, are you going to apply that then to every single conquest and every single harm where there could be remedy? I mean, and that could include even things like the U.S. government, having Japan be occupied. They forcibly rewrote their constitution. There's still military bases to this day. Does that mean now that Japanese have a right to U.S. land in terms of, a type of justice, a type of repayment? Do they have, a right to whatever? Because it's, if you're going to say, well, they lost the war, okay, well, then by that logic, so did the Palestinians. They lost the war. So
Right.
there is no consistency to that standard. And that's why, to me, libertarians don't work in that metric because it's all lacking consent. It's all lacking property rights. You can't pick winner and loser of all of history's harms without then creating new victims, and especially in the lack of clarity of history, knowing for sure exactly what happened. We today have the chance to teach people about libertarian ethics and to advocate for property rights everywhere, and to not keep playing this who's the biggest victim status. And I think that is what's lost when people try to play that game.
Yeah, and they also play authoritarian and dictator too. Like
Right.
they also partake in suddenly collectivizing groups of people and property ownership instead of seeing that it's individuals and individual property rights. So I think we ended up basically just pointing out and detailing what's wrong with Dave's positions when it comes to the state of Israel versus Hamas and Palestine. Do you think there's more that you want to say and summarize about how he's wrong in his positions there? Or should we move to Walter's position?
No, there's definitely a few more things wrong that we should take a look at because they're important to the discourse and things that people need to understand and think about when it comes to this, right? So when it comes to the questions of for example, Hamas and characterizing the nature of the situation, a lot of times people will say, well, Hamas is a creation of Israel and they funded them and all this other stuff. And I'll say, okay, well, name the time, day, location, amount given, and people involved of what this is. When I've looked at it, because a lot of people who mention these things are actually IDF whistleblowers, it's simply that the Israeli government allowed Hamas to exist and to get money from places like Iran and Qatar and to establish charities and schools and training centers. It's basically them just not stopping them getting funded from outside sources, or that's not stopping them getting people coming in and getting trained. So there's this weird situation that people find themselves in because of this. And it's that on one hand they say, well, they were supported by Israel. So I say, okay, well, should Israel have stopped them? And then they go, well, yeah, but I'm like, but then by that logic, you're saying that the Israeli government has a right to stop people going to training centers, schools, mosques, and getting money from foreign countries.
Yeah,
so,
the truth is they didn't support them then.
Right.
They left them alone. They didn't initiate because there wasn't an initiation at the time. If you're creating your own churches and schools and organizing, like if you're not initiating against anyone, then they should not have intervened like they didn't.
So, well, and fundamentally there, if they had intervened, then you would get the flip side, which would be, oh,
They're
Israel is shutting
violating
down,
rights.
right, is shutting down religion. They're,
Right.
they're oppressing people. They don't want people educated. They want to shut down schools. So there is no such thing as winning on that, because if you allow it to happen, then, oh, well, you sponsor terrorism. If you stop it, oh, you're stopping free speech and religion and education, and you hate children, you hate the poor. So there is no winning on that end. There's no such thing as that.
Well,
it's
from a
double-edged sword.
libertarian perspective, the former is the right action. It's if there was no initiation of force, you don't have the right to intervene between the trade of two people.
You don't. It's just that in this case, then the question is, okay, well, what's being done there, right? Because this is not simply, oh, we're doing this for education. They're preparing to launch an attack. They're being funded so they can buy weapons and funnel them in from Egypt underground so that they can go ahead and launch an attack, which brings in its own problem when we're talking about the nature of warfare and logistics, because there's a lot of people, they'll go back and forth. They'll say, oh, Hamas uses human shields and, they can't help, this or that. But we have to go even deeper than that. We have to sit here and say, okay, how do you deal with a situation, right, where the top surface area is all pretty much civilians, up top, normal people live in apartments, this or that. But underground, the entire underground is tunnels and a military base, right? You have to say, okay, what happens when you try to stop people from committing harmful acts, murder, rape, and things like that, when their entire base is underground and covered by a huge human shield?
Well, before we move on to that, because that's what happened after, the state of Israel didn't do anything and they kept building the tunnels. But like at the point, I guess I'm just still focused on the claim where people say like, oh, actually the state of Israel created Hamas. So your position is that they didn't. Is that
right? They didn't create Hamas was and this is Mustafa Sami Youssef was one of the children of the 7 founders. He writes about how it was formed and founded. And it was basically a religious reactionary organization. They were frustrated with people's lack of faith, with people not taking Islam seriously, and people, basically it was kind of like a revivalist movement, an equivalent, Christian revivalist movement in the U.S. would be like that.
For the religion of Islam.
For Islam, right. So he said that that's where it sprung from. And then among those people, some of them got more and more willing to do violent acts over time, basically. And he was a part of some of that starting, and then he diverted, his actions there and changed, how he believed about the situation. So
got it. So
yeah.
it wasn't formed because the state of Israel was like, hey, you need to.
Right. So that's one of these.
You need to be formed to
things.
fight this other group we don't like. Like
people think that it's
like the U.S. government, like the CIA has done many, many times. Like funding one side that's actual terrorists to fight this other side that are also terrorists, but then they create more powerful terrorists like ISIS.
Well, and what's also, and this is another libertarian
all
philosophical.
paid for by your taxes,
right?
Through force. Doesn't that make you mad? God, it makes me so mad. But yes, go on.
On the deeper philosophy, though,
Yeah.
this is also talking about moral agency, because you can sit there and say, okay, this government funded this person, or they gave them arms, or this or that. But that doesn't change the moral responsibility or agency of an individual. Just because the government gives you weapons doesn't mean, oh, well, I couldn't help but murder.
Yeah.
And people ascribed it to Hamas when they said, oh, well, there was these kids and they had a concert. And some people go as far as saying, oh, they couldn't help themselves. They just had to kidnap young girls and guys
rape them
and rape and kill.
them.
And it's like, what? You're saying they have no moral agency.
Yeah.
So divorcing the moral agency from the individual, when people start getting into, oh, they're a puppet or this or that, that's another philosophical problem.
Right, that's another error.
That's another error.
Because these same people would say, I don't care what your childhood was. You're a homeless man shooting up drugs at a public park. And your childhood doesn't matter. You're just a homeless man shooting drugs in front of the kids on this government park. Collectivized,
right.
forced ownership.
Horrible. Right. And that's
no, but I'm saying in that situation,
right?
Dave wouldn't care, and I'm calling out Dave. Doesn't care about that person being pulled away through force by the police, and saying that he's saying, no, you are morally culpable for your actions. I don't care your history. I don't care why you're addicted to drugs or homeless. I don't care. But then in this case, Hamas, October 7th, came in, murdered many people, women and children, kidnapped them, raped them. They're still hostages. They're just reacting. And they're just innocent victims. And you'd rape too. You'd rape innocent women and children too if... No, you wouldn't.
Well, and not even whether you would or wouldn't.
Really
It would just be unethical regardless. If you're not a
your
victim,
history doesn't matter. It's
right
like
when you are
in that case, if you become a victimizer yourself, an initiator of violence, a murderer yourself, a rapist, it doesn't matter what led you to that point. The fact is, you're a murderer and a rapist. You murdered and raped somebody innocent.
Right.
And you are responsible.
Exactly. And that's the whole point, is that you can't sit there and play two sides of the same coin and say, well, in this case, it's reactionary and whatever, poo-poo, okay, it's bad, but it's
especially because
reactionary.
if you say that,
yeah,
you'd have to say the Jews are reactionary.
Right.
Because so many people in those groups like Hamas will come out and be like, no, we want to kill all Jews. So how can you not then argue by your same way of thinking that the Jews are acting in self-defense, that they're reactionary, and that they would go ahead, and want to defend themselves too? In that case, I think defense is fine. It depends on what they're doing. And if they were raping, murdering, that would be just as bad.
Well, and the other part, too, that's important to talk about with this, because one of the things they brought up was they talked about the situation where an individual prisoner had been raped or accused of having been raped by Israeli soldiers, and there was this whole thing about it, and Walter Block had talked about that.
Right.
But I kind of chuckled to myself thinking in the comparative, because this type of situation, that is someone in prison and being raped, is a norm in U.S. prisons everywhere. Every day there are people being raped in U.S. prisons. And I know this, I'm a former criminal defense attorney, seen all kinds of crazy stuff. There are horrific conditions and tons of people in prison for victimless crimes, and they are abused by corrections officers and by inmates. It's a norm. But you don't go and collectivize all the U.S. because of the bad actions of some corrections officers or some inmates or living conditions in the prisons. You call out those conditions, but you don't go and say, well, every single person in the United States is a manifest destiny, evil, American imperialist, and they need to, have whatever imposed on them as justice for the crimes of the past federal government against the natives and the Mexicans and everything else, right? That's the Marxist collectivist class theory seeping into the discourse, instead of it being libertarian saying, no, we need to deal with individual actors and actions and consistently call for de-escalation of violence, privatization, and private market solutions.
Yeah, and provide equal justice. Like in the case of those Israeli soldiers, like if that's true, like raped this prisoner, they should be held responsible. But you shouldn't then collectivize and say, okay, see, therefore that's why Hamas murdered women and children, or innocent people, men, women, or children, whatever. You wouldn't then say that. That is making someone else responsible for other people's actions. You wouldn't say like, okay, now all Jews are responsible for those crazy, select, insane Israeli, like IDF soldiers who chose to rape that guy. Like that, you wouldn't do that. Just like you wouldn't say like, and do that in the U.S. Like if there's no connection, no relationship, that's irrational. You can't make someone responsible when they had nothing to do with it.
Right, and that's the curse of this collectivism and statism and working that framework, is that you start imputing the collectivist mentality of whatever the construct is, whatever government, this, that, to everybody, and you lose sight of what's going on and the root reasons why these conflicts are happening.
Right.
And that could be also ideological, because, again, you can complain about the militant statist form of Zionism, as opposed to the Zionism that's just Jews want to come back to land, they want to be able to restore the temple, all this other stuff, right? That in and of itself does not mean here's a particular type of state, right? But for those who are advocating for statism, that's going to be a problem on all sides, especially if your ideology is an exceptionally violent form of it,
right.
Which, of course, on the Hamas side, it most certainly is, right? People readily recognize the violence of the Israeli government, whether they're, enacting gun control,
right.
forced, shots,
Forced
whether
MRA
they're
shots.
right, controlling people's businesses or doing cronyism, which is all bad.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But then they go and they make it seem like as if, but if these people just get appeased in this way and they have their state, then it's rainbows and flowers after, right? And it's just, it's kind of silly.
And I think,
like, wait, what?
What? We focused a lot on Dave, but this is what we would fundamentally disagree with Dave and Walter on in this debate and position here, is their collectivism applied to the group that they have collectivized as being more innocent than the other and just reacting and acting in self-defense.
Right.
And that's the problem here. And really, philosophy requires rigor. It requires looking at individual actors and actions. And sure, it's easier, it's a better soundbite to be like, all Hamas is bad, all Jews are bad, or they're all good, or they're all bad. Instead of like, the complicated truth and reality, which is, okay, so this was founded by this specific guy or these specific groups of people, and they're part of Hamas, but not every single Hamas person, you would say, or Palestinian is like that. And you would have to be really specific in who you're calling a terrorist and who has actually done violence and harm, because there are people who are innocent that are being controlled by Hamas that you can't collectivize and say are responsible for what happened, the invasion on October 7th from Hamas. You can't say that the people being held hostage are one and the same. Just like you can't say the people of Israel, the individuals living in Israel who are conscripted, who are forced to fund Netanyahu and his administration for the Israeli government are the same. You have to be specific in actors and actions, or else what happens is you collectivize people, you ascribe intents and actions that they did not do and are not responsible for, and you then justify violence against them. And that's ultimately what we saw when it came to Dave and Walter's positions. I mean, would you agree with?
I would agree that the philosophy both espoused to underpin how they develop property rights would do that. And, we can talk about, Walter a bit now. I'll return to some more stuff on the other side as well soon.
Right.
But diving into that, Walter was trying to use a genetic / historical claim for saying who has the highest claim, where he was saying, okay, the Jews were there X, 1,000 years ago, and because the temple is underneath the Alaska Mosque, whatever, they have this higher claim thing. But that's not how property rights work. Property rights work on individual actors and actions. And in reality, in both cases, all these, these things historically have been built on conquest. Islamic conquest was a real thing that, people want to talk about, who was the indigenous people? But the reality is that the Arab migrations through Muslim conquest were themselves an imposition. It was people migrating across Africa up all the way up, through the Crusades and stuff like that.
That's a great point. Basically, and I see this happen too when it comes to for example, the debate in the United States of you should have immigration and border control and border police. There's this argument that comes out amongst some libertarians that I think are irrational and antithetical to the theory of property rights, is they try to say the highest taxpayer has the highest collective claim and they make up this collective group of taxpayers. And I'm I just want to say, unless you're a billionaire, you're not in there. Okay, anyway. But, they're just, I'm you're probably making I don't know, $2 an hour. No, I'm just kidding, or whatever it is. But you're I'm part of this high taxpayer. I'm just reality. You're not part of those corporations that do it. So don't make it that argument. Regardless, that's not libertarian theory. You're talking about a status situation. This would not have arisen from freedom and respect of individual rights, this situation. Conquest, that's completely antithetical to libertarian theory. So it's hard. I mean, you cannot say who then has the higher claim in that case. You have to actually base it on actual property rights. And you look at the individuals who live there. Who are the actual Jews? Aren't there actually Palestinians that live in Israel? And
there's a roughly between 150 and 160,000 around, people who are, Arab, who were kept in Israel because they stayed, they didn't flee. And that population ballooned to 2 million. So,
and they're there. And
they have rights. In terms of everything, they have homes. Literally, you could be a businessman. There's a Arab Supreme Court justice. There's literally politicians, the Knesset. So it's kind of like America, where it's there's a historical. There's a suppression thing with black people with slavery, but now today, obviously, there's black
different
people in Congress
races,
and
Irish,
Chinese
people, Japanese, throughout the U.S. government has targeted.
Right. It's one of those situations where you can talk and point to acts of racism or acts of displacement, but you couldn't collectivize it and say, well, everyone there is just under this apartheid regime. It's just completely false.
Yeah.
All the hallmarks of that point in the opposite direction. Really what you have is that the Israeli government's pretty violent when it comes to eminent domain, because they've kicked people out, both who are
both Jews
Palestinian,
and Arabs,
who are Arabs and Jews. They kicked the Jews out of the Gaza Strip. 2005, 2006, they cleared it out, and they cleared all the greenhouses that the Jews had there, and they lost that. So it's not one-sided, right? It's there can be disproportionate times, but it's not one-sided.
Collectivize,
right?
When you talk about who did what, don't say China.
China.
Okay, please, for the love of God. There are so many, there's billions of Chinese people.
1.5.
And they have nothing to do with what the Communist Party of China is doing. Nothing. In fact, they're victimized. They're violated. Right. So how can, just don't, that's irrational. That's not true. That's not reality. It's not China. It's specifically those in control of the CCP and inform that, for example. So you have to look at the state of Israel in this case And when it comes to advocating for what ought to be done, the focus as a Rothbardian, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, whatever, it's specifically about advancing towards the respect of individual body and property rights and dismantling all violations thereof. You know, that's always the goal. It's not about forming new governments. It's not about making the existing government work better. No, it's about, do you actually have individual property rights? Do you enact taxation? Is everyone forced to fund this the state of Israel by force? Yes, that's wrong. And that would, I mean, like, imagine, right? You take away from the state, the institutions called the state, government, monopolies on violence, you take away their ability to enact taxation, theft, and you take away now this ability for a corrupt group of people to gain control of that power apparatus, the state, and to do whatever they want, and to put guns in your face when you disagree. And you're like, yo, I'm just trying to work and feed my family. What the heck? And they're like, no, give it up. We're trying to fight Hamas over here, and you don't give us 20% of your income, we're going to murder you. You know, I mean, that's what you get when you collectivize and you stop focusing on individual rights. And you go, oh, you know, we're already taxed today. Americans are already taxed today. So why not just reallocate that taxation to universal health care, to Medicare for all, which, you know, it wouldn't happen in practice. It would be, you know, long wait lines like you have in Canada, crappy medicine. You have Canadians coming to America for better health care, and then you have Americans going to Mexico for like dental stuff because it's like less regulated. You know, people want, if like freedom is what creates innovation, choices, options. And so that's really what we need if we want to get out of perpetual war. And that's what you have. War is the health of the state. War is what a government can use to continue to infinity collectivizing people and saying, therefore, this group doesn't have rights because other people that we put in that group did bad things. And so, you know, just by virtue of us putting them in that group together, like you're all Chinese, you don't have rights. You're not allowed to move. You're not allowed to trade with this guy in America and Airbnb over here or rent his house or buy his house from him and now you own the house. You're not allowed because you're Chinese or you weren't born here or whatever. And that's what happens when you have collectivism and statism. You don't think about people as individuals anymore with rights and their own separate beliefs and actions and experiences. You just say, oh, you look like this guy and so you must be bad and therefore you're not allowed the same rights as this other guy that is associated with people who I don't think are bad, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I see is both Dave and Walter have their own obvious biases and collectivizations of these groups of people, of these groups of individuals who are varying in history. You know, like not all Palestinians are part of Hamas.
Right.
Some of them are just like, I just want to live. Just like they're probably like me and you, like Americans, like maybe just practically ancap where they try not to be, you know, having too many government papers tied to them. And they're like, okay, I just want to be like kind of like nomadic and just like free to move around the world and not have anyone like saying you belong to me and you're going to fight for us now. Like they probably don't want Hamas to come in and they probably hate Hamas. There's probably people living there who don't like being ruled by Hamas and controlled by them, and they don't like the violence and having military bases all around where they should be in peace. So
right, yeah. I mean, there's you
that's
can
the
say that
problem
all
of collectivization.
around
That's why you can't.
But just getting back to the philosophical roots now,
right?
You know, because I want to really, you know, home in on what it was that there was errancy. So Walter, as we were talking about before, he was talking about having that genetic kind of history leading up to whether you would have property rights, and that type of collectivism, again, it doesn't work when you have everyone and the ripple effects of everyone's situation being a product of conquest, right? It's very difficult to say who has the right to this.
It's more like welcome to the club,
right? When
history everywhere.
World War
right.
I, World War II,
Good
Vietnam
point.
War, Korea War, all this stuff. Everyone's existence and situation is a product of the violence, the random carvings out of different political elite leaders. You can't rectify all that violence. So,
For me, it's like the Huns, right?
Yeah. Genghis Khan.
Yeah,
right.
And the
Knocking down a whole city.
Taking over.
Right. So,
many,
it's just
rape.
something that you can't realistically, ethically, consistently rectify. So his collectivist framing on that is not a consistent metric, and it would keep everyone in perpetual conflict. Like, oh, I wonder if my ancestor 5,000 years ago owned this, and oh, you're, what I mean? You'd be constantly fighting over nonsense.
And then you have conflicts when you both have ancestors who were conquested,
right? And they may have fought each
or
other,
or were conquerors,
right?
And now you're in the state of, just like I was saying earlier, where you have this weird idea of collective taxpayer ownership. Like, now you're stuck fighting and trying to say, well, 3 years ago I paid $150,000 in taxes, and you only paid $149. Therefore, I technically,
you don't want to
how do
continue
you do
this
that with the
tragedy.
conquest? Like, okay, 400,000 of my ancestors were conquested. Oh, but then in this other time they were also conquerors.
Right.
So let me subtract.
It's just a
And
never-ending victim status
you
battle.
have a difference of like 200,000 bodies, and you're like, see, I own this place, and the other person's like, no, I literally bought this home, whether it's from the stupid, Federal Reserve Bank that we're forced to whatever.
Right. And I just want to cut you off real quick because I want to get back to the
is about
specifics
yeah.
of Israel here. Specifically in
Sure,
Israel, there was this complaint like, oh, Israel has 90% of the land, but there's a collectivist issue on both sides. The Israeli government makes generalized claims without homesteading. When people talk about, oh, well, the Palestinians, what did they have? They also made collectivist things. That wasn't 100% of the land homesteaded by the people who were there either. Mm-hmm. They just draw and color it like a goofy kid on with a crayon. It's like, oh, look, they had this whole thing. No, they didn't homestead all the region that is modern day Israel. They did not physically homestead. In fact, most of it was uninhabitable. It was ridden with malaria, and it was basically desert.
Therefore, unclaimed.
Right.
And in a state of nature.
So,
per libertarian theory, you would say no one owns that. You would say it was
the
open
conflicts
for grabs.
and the issues that go, again, they go both ways.
Yeah.
People complain about Jews who were coming down and then eventually stopped because the British were halting immigration. But then there was also people coming from Egypt who were illegally...
When the video got cut there, we reached a limit, so now here we are.
Yeah, sorry, the video got cut real quick, so we're just gonna restart this. So again,
this ain't live.
We're gonna I'm gonna run this down really fast, right? You had illegal, right? You had a legal settlement of people coming in from what was Transjordan, Egypt, stuff like that. They were coming in and coming out, especially to work depending on season, right? So nobody talks about those things. Nobody talks about, okay, the Palestinians who were kicked out of Kuwait because they supported Saddam Hussein. They kicked out nearly 300,000 of them. There's 200,000 Palestinian people who are in Lebanon, who are refugees. They can't buy property. They are banned from many professions, right? But nobody cares with them because, again, when the violence is on that side, it's like, oh, well, we don't care, right? If it's Arab, Muslim, nobody cares. So in terms of the Western discourse.
It's almost like a simplistic thinking. They look the same, so, it's just family beef. Like, no one's freaking out about the CCP, but I am. And other Chinese people, but they're you know what I mean? From a Western media journalism coverage, the focus is on oh, Palestinians are victim, and look at the Jews, they look different, they're bad. And then where's the coverage of the CCP and the literal Holocaust happening there?
Well, again,
anyway.
it's just I don't want to move away from the topic at hand. I'm trying to keep it very focused. But the narrow focus here is that there is oppression that goes all the way around. Israel's conscription. So does Saudi Arabia. So does Kuwait. So does all these other Iraq. All these countries, they have conscription too.
Doesn't Hamas have?
Yeah, they force people to fight this.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So again, they have young people fighting all that stuff.
Mm.
The point being is that the violence, the theft, it's all around. And the more that you just play who's the biggest victim, who's the most oppressor, you keep missing out on the fact that you're not actually getting to a libertarian order. You're not saying, hey, no matter what, if you're not getting toward a free market defense, changing minds for liberty, moving away from collectivism, moving away from the state being the central planning of solutions, you haven't done anything. You're just sitting there and saying...
No, worse, you have done
Oh, yeah,
something.
you're doing something worse.
You are justifying more violence and war from your collectivist thinking. And now you are continuing the cycle of violence, getting further and further away from that libertarian order society that in Capistan that we apparently want together as Rothbardians, right?
Right. Well, and not just that, it's literally the question between whether or not you're creating something that's sustainable versus getting people to constantly compromise and think, oh, okay,
right,
I have a power
pragmatism.
fantasy, right, that I control the Middle East policy. It's like, no, you don't. You're whatever. You're
and you
you're
control all
here.
Individuals.
Right. You don't control all individuals.
And there's going to be no foul play, no assassination attempts.
There's no sectarian conflict among those other
there's
people.
There's no mysticisms driving hatred.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's really incredible.
They just want peace too.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So those also have to be rooted out.
Peace.
Otherwise, you will continue to support statism and violence. You have to get to voluntarism at the root, and you have to educate people on these things. And you have to recognize if you don't have power over that, what do you have the power to do? You have the power to change minds for liberty principally here locally. You can affect things with those you know, your family, your friends. If you have maybe a bigger social media, maybe you could have some influence there. If you do go to your town meetings or have something like that, you could do something there.
Right. Educate on the principles of liberty, the philosophy of liberty, and the individual rights that we should have.
Right. You need to get people to consistently
It's not about freedom of speech, freedom to own guns or whatever weapon. No, it's about property rights. Those are derived from that foundation of rights.
Right. So yeah, and it is a matter of recognizing that all these different types of conflicts and things that people complain about Israel. Israel is not the only government that the United States funds. It has a big amount of funding, but the next two top funded countries after that add up to more than Israel. And
Isn't
the ones after
US
that
government, they have military bases all around the
U.S.
world.
government
hundreds.
750 bases, 80 countries.
Oh, 750.
So it's literally, this is not just Israel, though people like to find that as like, oh, that's the thing, and it's like,
well,
no,
it's the current thing, guys.
It's the current
Don't
thing,
you understand?
Right. But if you just think it's there and you think, oh, well, that's my salvation, you've totally missed the boat because it has to be everywhere because the government is funding every side. You know, when there was October 7th, President Biden, he gave $100 million. He authorized $100 million for Palestine relief. Right? Aid. So this idea that it's just it's just one side. No, there's funding that goes in everywhere. You know,
hey, that's that your mom and pop's 20, 30 grand out the window that they're forced to fund. Their income taxes. Like, it's crazy.
It is something that transcends that, and you have to be consistent.
And that's the violence that you miss when you keep being collectivist. I just want to add on to what you're saying, like why that's the point. You know,
right? If you miss out that the root is all foreign aid, it's not just one place. Then you're going to sit there and keep thinking, well, this will solve the problem because they just want this state or they just want this thing. It's like, that's not going to solve the root. And the violence will continue.
You keep
and
fueling
statism. Excusing it and saying, well, it's just them reacting. And then you're in Marxist class theory at that point because you're like, well, they're just in a constant struggle against their oppressors. It's all good versus all bad. You're the white colonists.
And we need a collective colonial force to come in and do something about it and make it right.
And that's why all the Marxists on campus support that effort because it fits their class warfare theory. They're anti-colonial.
Right, why you have all the tents for free Palestine and
they want to bring about what they see as global colonialism's end from the British empires and, of course, a little French there too. They want to undo that.
But not just undo, replace.
And then replace
with Marxist authoritarianism,
with
socialism, communism, a new world order. And we're like, no, that's horrendous. And if you, as someone who says you're libertarian, are libertarian, you are confused in this case when you fall victim to collectivism. And it's hard. Human mind is prone to error. So we're just saying, hey, you're erring here, Dave Smith, Walter Block. and you can have a chance to be consistent with your principles that you espouse and advocate for.
Exactly, and that's what we wanted to
Instead
just
of
talk about here.
perpetuating statism.
Is stop perpetuating statism.
Yeah.
No,
it's
stop the
easy to miss, right?
Yeah.
All the memes about the current thing, NPCs. Oh my God, we gotta throw billions at Ukraine because didn't you see Russia invaded Ukraine? And while that's true, we should not be conscripted. Conscription is slavery. Taxation is slavery. It doesn't excuse those things. What strangers did abroad is not suddenly something I should have a gun put to my head to fund. And when you don't call that out, when you end up picking sides between dictators, authoritarians, tyrants, Netanyahu, Hamas, like either side, like, dude, you're supporting literal terrorists. It's like, it's like here you look at the Democrat and Republican candidates, how they're all authoritarian. They want to continue the military industrial complexes, pharmaceutical industrial complexes, all the industrial complexes, hot dogs. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But, like you realize that they are authoritarian. And when you are told by the mainstream news outlets in America, for example, that, oh my God, you better choose red or blue or else, you're realizing that you're being forced to choose between two terrorists. And I say that because domestic terrorists, you could call them, the U.S. federal government. I mean, how is it not? You are extorted. You are enslaved. Your property is not your own. It will be taken from you if you stop paying your property taxes. What happens if you don't pay income taxes? Look at Peter Schiff's dad, Erwin Schiff. He died in prison for income tax evasion, which is not just a
Roger
false crime. Like, right. Income, like Roger Ver, even now, like for what? Keeping your money. That's a right. That's called a human individual right, to keep your wealth. And so that's what we're saying is like you become the very NPCs that you make fun of, who are like, oh, the current thing, gun control now, climate change now. You make fun of them, right? And yet here you are being just like them, falling prey to the propaganda of the state on either side. When you choose to have a question like, do you support the state of Israel or not in their fight? And then you make the whole conversation about these nuances of actors and actions that you don't control, who are dictators, who are violent, evil, murderous people, who will lie, cheat, and steal to remain in power, who are not Javier Milei afuera, like, I want liberty for all, anarcho-capitalista, like such different, like you could say heaven or hell, angel or devil, like in this case, like when you talk about libertarianism versus statism. I mean, that's what we're saying is why people have to stay focused on liberty, because when you don't, you make violence. I mean, you make excuses for more violations on liberty, and you perpetuate that cycle that we're trying so hard to end.
Right, and just one last thing to wrap it up, because I know we're running out of time here on this card. On that note, I did want to have one other thing where we just talk about limiting violence, of course, because Walter Block was talking about how when Hamas, uses human shields, whatever happens with casualties, because it comes to that.
Yeah, I was like, ooh.
Yeah, and that's again, that's another problem.
Collectivist.
Right, because. Yeah. And how I formulate it here is that when you're using defensive force, for it to be defensive, it has to be narrowly tailored to the actor and should be reasonably expected to not hurt other innocent people generally in order for it to be enacted. Like, you're trying to narrowly tailor your defense to that specific person and making sure it doesn't hurt other people, right? So one example we had talked about before was that if you happen to wake up because you hear your doors being kicked in by some robber, murderer in the middle of the night. And let's just say you get strapped, you take him out, but as you shoot him, the bullet penetrates and it happens to hit your neighbor and they die. That's given, that is the moral responsibility, the culpability is given to the person who broke in, because it's reasonable that you're aiming at that person. You did use, diligent aim, but there was an accident that took out
the neighbor. And so that fault lies with the person who broke in. But you wouldn't expect to be able to, nuke a whole city to stop a robber who got in your house and was fleeing, because you would escalate the violence unreasonably, and it's expected that you're just going to kill lots of innocent people. So when it comes to tactics and things and dealing with these things, it's okay to say that in trying to take somebody out, there is sometimes going to be innocent people who die in crossfire, for example. You don't control at the end that someone shooting back at you is not going to hurt people. You may not control that maybe you go after somebody, they set off a bomb, and it brings down a building, right?
The question is, did you initiate that situation of aggression? Because it's war, and it feels continuous, but technically each battle of every day is new.
Right.
People eat, people sleep, they poop.
So you need,
and they literally right, and they
you need
start
to narrowly
new.
tailor.
So somebody initiated that particular event that day. Like, you have to get that granular. Like, it is. That is how complicated it is.
Right. And again, it's not something where it's necessarily easy, and it's not necessarily going to be always, no innocent people dying, because the fact of the matter is, and we were talking about this, if, let's just say you want to go after someone who's, fleeing, they shot off a rocket, Hamas agent going through a tunnel, they get to the end of the tunnel, there's explosives by an apartment, they set those off as you're chasing them, right? That could be a consequence of trying to tail somebody, right? But that's going to happen no matter what to that person who's willing to do anything to end your life and other people's lives is stopped. So it's just a matter of trying to avoid being the person who escalates, especially where there are other alternatives or other avenues that are within your capability of using to take out the threat. And so it's just a matter of choosing those that are not going to escalate violence.
Yeah.
And hurt, more innocent people, create more blowback, which again, that's going to be a product of that. You kill innocent people. They're not going to care whether there was someone that shot a rocket. They're going to be mad at you for life. It's, so it's going to be a never ending cycle. So it's very self-destructive to do that.
Yeah. I think that, from our as ANCAPs libertarians, we would say, when it comes to the people who were taken hostage on October 7th and who are still there, people are trying to get them out. Israelis are trying to bring them home. And that's in their right to. Those individual people who are choosing upon if they're not conscripted, if they're not forced, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
There are many that have volunteered to just be like, oh my God, I want to rescue those people. My brother, my sister, my mom, my dad, whatever, my child, and that's where you have these insane situations where they're in the middle of schools, like you said, like actual military bases like Hamas has there. And that's where you have this difficult situation of how do you navigate through that and minimize other deaths of innocent people while you're trying to rescue innocent, Israelis or Jews or whoever you're trying to rescue.
On a final
Hamas.
note of that, just to talk about the specifics of the tactics, and I think this is just important because people don't walk through it. Like in economics, we always say, and then what, and then what, and then what. Why isn't that happening when you talk about rescuing hostages, right?
Yeah.
You have a few options. You're going to either, of course, try to send in people on ground or by air or by boat, right? If you're going to do a rescue operation. If you do certain types of tactics, people might get alerted that you're coming, and then they're going to abscond with the hostages or maybe kill people, this or that, right? So you have this situation where it's like you want to rescue people, but to do so, you also have to invade because you have to physically send in people who are armed with guns to go rescue the hostages.
And there's risks,
and there's risks of people getting shot.
Because there's booby traps, or you can be murdered by someone else.
And that's why there's this other thing where if you say, okay, well, we want to minimize people being killed, the only thing left you have is evacuation. Because if you evacuate everybody, say, we're going to clear out all the tunnels, we're going to seal them up, we're going to get rid of the booby traps, we're going to take munitions.
Because there are hostages
that's all you have left.
That Hamas has. And because the
Yeah.
other thing is to negotiate with actual terrorists and to be like, oh, okay, we'll cede this portion of land to you if you give us our, these people back. And
Well,
whatever,
and that's rewarding
and you free
kidnapping because now you just said
exactly.
if you kidnap, you get what you want.
Which in my opinion, as a libertarian, that's not an option. You don't incentivize murder and rape.
Right.
You don't incentivize kidnapping. That's why the phrase is there. You don't negotiate with terrorism or murderers or rapists because you don't want to encourage them again. You don't want to show them that, see, I can just do this and other people just now bend to my will and be my slave. No, it's like, no, fine. It's war. And that's more the point. And I agree with what you said, how, in that situation, if you're not going to negotiate with terrorists and encourage them, well, then you're left with rescuing the people who have been kidnapped and are being held hostage and being used as political tools. Because ultimately, what does Hamas want? Why are they doing that? They want leverage to be like, you better give us what we want or else.
Right.
Like they're being murderous.
And that's the nature of all states and burgeoning states, right? It's mafias, and they use leverage and death threats to try to get what they want. Exactly. It doesn't matter whether it's Israel, Hamas, Iraq, Iran,
cartels
United States,
in Mexico, CCP.
It's not confusing.
The British government.
Not confusing, right? People who reject voluntarism.
Catholic Church.
Right, use threats and violence to get what they want. It's not hard. So if we want a libertarian future, we have to educate people on these principles. We have to say this is the direction. We can't keep playing, we got to play historical,
play.
Fix it all rainbows and magically we'll fix all past conquests. No.
Right.
We can't do that. It's not practical. It's practically impossible, and it would just aggregate more wealth.
No, we can just nuke whoever we want, and then we can just recreate what we want, right? No, it's difficult. Changing minds is hard. Trying to have peace is hard, but that is the way that you should advocate for if you call yourself a Rothbardian.
Exactly.
Like, geez. What?
It's just
like,
lost
what
in
do
the
you
process.
mean we gotta go? You gotta send your kids to public school. You don't have an option.
Yeah.
It's like, no, we should end property taxes. What the
Right, yeah. That's a whole
send your
topic.
kids to go get picked cotton because we're forced to fund it. I know it's another topic.
It's another topic for another day.
But it's tangentially related.
Right. So we appreciate that y'all stay with us this long. If you're here to the end,
Yeah,
that's pretty
thanks.
crazy. This was
It
a
is
much longer
crazy.
video than I thought it was going to be.
Yes,
So.
tell us what you thought. Do you like this format?
Yeah.
Usually we go live, but I personally like it. It's
Yeah.
fun. It gives a different, focus. We can really focus on the conversation topic at hand. So yeah, let us know in the comments. Subscribe.
And we didn't even cover all the issues and topics I could possibly do.
didn't.
There's so much more I can
Yeah,
get
so
into
let
with
us know if
history
you
and
want a part
philosophy,
2, and we can
Yeah.
elaborate. And if you have any questions, maybe we'll
Right.
do a follow-up video like this.
But at least this gets it started. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
And we'll see you soon. Soon enough for our music video release, right?
Yeah, and don't forget, taxation stuff and the Fed focus on individual liberty. And that is how we get out of this state as hell.
That's right.
Amen.